Thank you for joining us at our local control panel. It is a pleasure and an honor to be with you. My name is Samantha Master, but my loved ones call me Sam, and I invite you all to as well, since now we're cousins. And we're here to talk to you about local control. So I'm gonna not talk for a long time. I wanna turn it over to the panelists. So first, tell us your name, friends, and why did you say yes to organizing towards justice and liberation? And I'll start on the far right with Ray, the far left, my left, y'all right.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ray Kelly. I'm the executive director of the Citizens Policing Project. And why did I say yes to organizing and movement work? Is because I've grown up, operated, and lived in a community impacted by police misconduct my whole life. And the change has to start within.
Afternoon, Sergio Spagna, Director of Engagement and Mobilization at the ACLU of Maryland. Like many of us that are here, there's no one answer for why we're here, but one thing that sticks out is just knowing how arbitrary power dynamics are and the impact that we can have when we have that analysis and we push for collective liberation. In high school, once I started getting involved after 9/11 and supporting folks speaking out against the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, I started reading Frantz Fanon, and he's got this quote that just changed my life where he says, "Every generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it." And so like that just kind of, after that, I was just like, okay, so what can I do? Just kept going.
Thank you so much. My name is Lidia Walter Rodriguez. I am the Chief of Organizing and Leadership with CASA. You know, I am an Afro-Latina immigrant who immigrated here to the US. I've been calling Baltimore my home for the last 14 years. And a big part of transitioning into movement work for me was very personal, having directly impacted family members who were affected by the injustice of the immigration system, in addition to layering that to racial injustices, in addition to experiencing, as a first-generation immigrant myself, somewhere that I finally called home. Baltimore has been the place in the US I have lived the longest, and being part of so many different uprisings within the city that I call home, and also seeing how the media portrays the face of the Latino, the face of the immigrant, and how we are also pushed in to being part of the systemic anti-Blackness, right? And wanting to dismantle that within my own community, but also dismantling the system that pushes to blame ourselves for our outcomes, but really being able to bring our people together to look at the top and look at why the system was created this way, to continue to oppress us and point the fingers at each other instead of coming together and really working to make a new system that we call our own.
And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raleek Hayes. I am a senior organizer with the Legal Defense Fund and Deputy Director of Organizing Black. I came to movement because as a young person, I was 12, 13 at the time, I met with the governor of the state of Maryland, and he pretty much told me that there was no way I could know what I was talking about. There was no way I could have the capacity to understand. And for that lit a fire in me to fight, to organize, to prove that I actually do understand things and can be right.
I love that. So we are sitting here in sacred land. People often say Maryland's not the South, but I'm here to let y'all know that Maryland is the South. Y'all not finna keep claiming Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, Henry Highland Garnett, and all of them, and then X us out of the South. We are the South. And so, as we are sitting on this sacred land that has been cultivated by many generations of freedom fighters, I wanna know why local control? Why was that the fight we chose? What's the historical context of local control?
Ray, you wanna kick us off?
So, it's complicated when you talk about municipal policing, but the fact is that since 1860, the Baltimore Police Department was a state agency. And it plays into exactly what Sam said, that we are the South. So there are multiple theories and stories on how this actually occurred. Most prominent and proven is that it was a political response to riots in Baltimore City. There was a political party, they were known as the Know Nothing Party, but their chartered name was actually the Native American Protestant Republican Party. And
The Bill the Butcher Party, basically.
right. And they were pro-South. They were anti-Catholic, a big piece was they didn't see how Baltimore, which was considered a free city and a Confederate state, would actually pay black people for labor. They didn't feel they had to. They were in the South. And as we approached these elections in 1856, there were riots. I believe there were 12 people killed in these riots on Pratt Street, and 6 Democratic political candidates were killed. So one theory is that to maintain a democratic process with this election and to commence some more scrutinous oversight, the state took over. There's another theory that comes through community that because essentially those politicians that were killed in Maryland were breaking the law by paying black people, that the state wanted to make sure that the city was following the laws of the state, so they took over the police department. So that's kind of how we probably got into that situation. Essentially, we remained a state agency until 2022. And really, that's up for debate at the very moment. So this, for me, has been a long, long fight. I first found out that essentially BPD was a state agency in like 2008.
Yeah.
But in my community advocacy, I was more focused on police abuses and broken relationships, and I felt like it had been that way for almost 150 years, nothing I have to worry about. But then as the years moved on, then it became a process of police accountability. So my first experience in 2012, ironically, was to strengthen Baltimore's Civilian Review Board. And that's when local control actually became an issue in our work. So we knew that we were moving forward. The federal investigation actually started in 2014. We knew we were moving forward with these, so we were trying to implement immediate changes, and we couldn't. And everything had to happen during the 3 months of legislative session and had to be decided by a consensus of all 23 counties to actually make a change to Baltimore City's police department. So that's when we decided that we would kind of take on this mantle of bringing local control back to Baltimore City. So I was then the CEO of another organization called the No Boundaries Coalition, and that was the prerequisite to actually having police accountability and civilian oversight in this city was giving access to the impacted community, which meant bringing that debate to Baltimore City and City Hall and not in Annapolis.
And Ray, I want to jump in on this point, right? Because thank you for laying this really beautiful runway, if you will, about how long this fight is. There's a slide up here that talks about from something you sent me about the 1861 riots. And then in 2016, the Organizing Black, which both Ralik and I are part of, as part of our core demands, demanded local control, right? And so talk a little bit about how many of y'all were here, how many of y'all heard of the murder of Freddie Gray? How many of you all took action around the murder of Freddie Gray? Right, so that was a catalyzing moment in our country, certainly in our city and state. How do you think the murder of Freddie Gray, the murder of Tyrone West, which many folks have not heard of Tyrone West, but was killed by Morgan State Police, which is a historically black college police. His sister still does West Wednesdays to this day. There's one yesterday. And the shooting, almost fatal shooting, luckily it wasn't, of Keith Davis Jr., impacted the fight for local control.
Thank you so much, Sam and Ray, for giving us that history and for pivoting us into, the moments that make this real. We're all sitting here together as a coalition that came together a little bit over 11 years ago. And it was really, as Ray mentioned, right, the anti-immigrant, anti-black, white supremacist reasons for, the state taking the power of Baltimore City to have local control of its police force. And Baltimore City is one of two in all of the United States, one of two cities in all of the United States that does not have local control of its police department. And, Sam just gave us the, painted the picture of the why, right? And that was a big question that we as different community organizers, advocates, we had been doing work together so much longer than 11 years ago. We had been continuing to go to the State House for only 90 days a year is when we can change any laws that directly impact our city because the state has the control. Versus every other county in Maryland, every other city in the US can do that locally through their municipality. So you have to ask yourself why a city of over 90% black and brown community members has to go to the state to ask for change when it's directly impacting those in our neighborhood. And, a lot of our fights against the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights on the state level, all of our local fights to hold police accountable, to have the oversight of community, they were all limited because we did not have local control, right? So we could not really talk about accountability until we won local control. And for the past 11 years, it continued to be a battle of the why. Why can't we have local control, right? And it was very apparent that it was a fear of black and brown folks having oversight of the city. We kept coming back to that each time, right? After the murder of Freddie Gray, as different grassroots organizations, we came together to say we cannot continue to go back to the state for 90 days a year, and that be sufficient for our people. We have to come together on a grassroots way and fight 365 plus days a year, right? And so we actually came together and convened a grassroots coalition called the Campaign for Justice, Safety, and Jobs. All of us here in this table are part of that coalition. We've been together for a little bit over 11 years, and there's over 30 different grassroots organizations, state level and national organizations that have also joined this fight. And we've been chipping away and had tremendous victories on the state level, on the local level, but we know that our North Star is local control. We cannot have real change for our people until we have local control, and we can reform and hold our local officials accountable for not holding police accountable in our city. So we continue to come together to really fight that, but again, it's about directly impacted Baltimore residents not having access to changing and reforming the accountability of their own police and having to go outside of Baltimore to try to win and reform those changes.
And if I could add to that just super quick, just reiterating your point, Lydia, around how so much of why for a century and a half we haven't had local control, it unquestionably stems from a fear of black folks, brown folks making it clear that they can police themselves. But I would also add to that a fear of giving up that level of racist control over our city. For over a century and a half, across the state, it was not having local control was this perfect cover for both city officials and state officials to every year say, oh, we only have 90 days. We can't really take on police reform. I'm not from Baltimore City. I feel like it wouldn't be my place to do that. Then Baltimore City Council members saying the same thing. Look, obviously we want to have solid accountability, but we can't do that. We have to take it up with the state. So everyone got to wash their hands decade after decade after decade while our city kept suffering. Some great TV shows have come out of that horror. A lot of lives have been lost because of that horror. Our city has been stunted because of the lack of local control, intentionally, so as to be able to say, you see what happens? You see what happens when there's a majority black city? When what's really happening is that folks were not able to lead themselves. And as soon as there's that process is allowed, we improve. We have seen a sharp decline in homicides over the last couple of years as aspects of local control have started to get into place. We're still not there. We're going to talk about some of those details. We've seen, and part of that local control is like not just literally getting local control, but also having a change in philosophy to violence, seeing it as a public health issue, knowing that we need community members to lead themselves, making sure that we're investing resources, not just in BPD, but in other effective strategies like Safe Streets, like what folks at the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement are doing at Muncie, that's working. And so I just think it's important to point out that our city has had a lot of challenges. Those challenges are not because we did not have solutions for ourselves. It's because we were set up.
And if I could just add in that, I think that's a perfect segue, right? Like when we talk about Baltimore, it's not just policing we didn't have control over, right? Like it's water, it's education, it's transportation, right? Like it's all these critical services that for the longest time, and some still are, right, are controlled at a state level, not a local level. And so when we talk about investments into communities, redlining or disinvestment from communities, there is a racial control, right? Like there is a racial power there that for a long time, black people in the city, because this is a majority black city, have not had, right? And so when you think about the image of Baltimore that the outside world sees, you wonder how we got there. There's a lack of investment, right? And then I want to also just connect another thread, which is when we're thinking about, as we picked up this campaign, what was going on in the world, right? Like we think about Freddie Gray, but I'll take it a step back to Mike Brown and even Trayvon Martin, right? Like how all these things are happening in the country, right? And we see other cities demanding accountability and justice and whatever that looks like for them, right? And we had to have a moment of strategy in this city to be like, to even get to accountability, right? Like we can't even ask for the things that some of these other cities are asking for because our police department is not controlled by us, right? And so it was really critical, a strategy point of view, to be like, we have to dismantle other systems, right? We have to actually learn how they work to get there. And we'll talk a bit more about that.
Yeah. And Raleek, you mentioned, that moment. We had to have a moment, right? Our moment of crisis to uplift so many of the things we all knew was going on wrong systemically so that folks would listen, right? Unfortunately, Freddie Gray had to die for us to uplift that narrative from a grassroots way. And a way that we came together as a grassroots coalition was to push the Department of Justice to interview and hear directly from people on the ground instead of doing their investigation like they usually do, right? We filled churches, we filled recreational centers, we filled community centers. The Department of Justice heard directly from people, thousands and thousands of Baltimorean, black and brown, of their accounts with Baltimore City Police. And all of those testimonies made it into that report that ultimately led to a consent decree happening in our city. And that work wouldn't have even started if it wasn't for the people organizing, coming together, and uplifting and sharing their stories. And we got a report of thousands of pages of unconstitutional policing taking place in the city. We knew this was happening for years, but for the first time, we actually had a report in black and white we can use in the legislature, and we can use to push the city towards our North Star, which is local control.
And so this is super juicy. What are y'all thinking in this moment? What's percolating for you in the audience? Go ahead, friend. You can shout out, or we can bring you a mic, whatever's most comfortable.
I'll shout out. Gary Libby. I'm thinking now we have our first black governor in the state of Maryland. How does Governor Moore being in office impact this work and the path forward?
I'll take a couple of other. So I hear one question about how does the new governor, Governor Moore, shift what's possible?
If at all.
If at all.
I don't assume.
Okay, amen. I see one here. I see Stat. My beloved friend in the green and my beloved friend in the blue.
Hi, this is great conversation. I think my question is related, which is we had this moment, right? Trayvon Martin, and then Mike Brown, and then Freddie Gray, and George Floyd, and all the women in between, right? Rekia Boyd, that
Torin
we
Gaines.
felt like there was a groundswell of power. And I feel like even the momentum for the local control, there was built like riding the wave of this groundswell, like we need to move this thing, and even if we need to fight it on our own. But I feel like the law and order sort of perspective from state actors and the federal government and the approach to politics is becoming the norm again. And so I don't want it to be another hashtag name for the groundswell to start again. So what should we look to motivate us to push?
Yeah, that's a good one.
I love that.
Yeah.
And then our beloved friend in the blue behind you. And our beloved friend and coalition member, Lorena, is also in beautiful blue and is doing the mic running. Thank you, Lorena.
Hello, my name is Hade. My pronouns are she, her. I'm from San Antonio, Texas. I'm really grateful to hear y'all's perspective on fighting for local control because we're actually on the opposite end. One of our biggest challenges is fighting reform. In our city, we have over 60 departments that we're trying to get reform with. Because we have a lot of municipalities, schools, colleges, via like the transit police as well. So like we also have ledge that's only once every 2 years. So my thoughts are like, how do we find that sweet spot between being able to go to your city officials and be like, well, you need to fix this issue, and being able to have like a centralized, these are what, of course, like policing in general is just a no, but you know what I mean? Like having a centralized, these are the police, these are the policies for everyone in Texas. So our thoughts have been that, like, how do we make it more centralized? So thank you.
So I can.
I want to recap those three questions just so they're at the front of folks' minds. So I heard one question from Gary about how does Governor Moore shift what's possible? Does Governor Moore shift what's possible? First black governor in the state of Maryland. Our beloved friend here wanted to kind of surface that we don't want people to continue to die. And so how do we not use death as an impetus for our organizing? And my friend here, what I'm hearing, tell me if this is the spirit, is that how do you find the sweet spot between organizing for local control, but also standardizing what is happening across these departments?
So I'll just start real quick on each one. So with Governor Moore, to be determined. Definitely don't see it as a detriment, but frankly, the whole point of local control is that it shouldn't matter who the governor is in terms of how we move ahead in our city. The bill's been signed. There's been the support for it, but at the core, it's to make sure that the city, regardless of what's happening at a state level, is able to be consistent in tracking what's worked and what hasn't, and is held accountable by local residents. So so that's my first thought on that. On this, the second point, one thing, Veronica, from your question that sticks out is we were very fortunate that Baltimore has been very well organized for a long time. And so when 2020 and the uprising took place in 2015, and then there was this, several years beforehand and several years through that, and then there was a 2020 summer movement where there were opportunities, and it was just very clear that essential legislation needed to pass the next session. We had folks in Baltimore City and across the state that had done the research, that had had meetings with legislators for years and so on, had met with BPD, with city officials, and had an agenda pretty much kind of at the ready that was very concrete in terms of repealing the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which is an Orwellian name for that came out. This bill started as a direct response to the civil rights movement, where cops afterwards were like, okay, well, let's pass a bill that says that we're still above the law. And so we have our own Bill of Rights, and you can't take us to court. You got to give us 10 days to get our story straight. Just a whole bunch of nonsense. We knew that local control was going to be essential. We knew that we needed to reform the Maryland police, basically our version of FOIA, the MPIA, to make sure that police misconduct records were easily accessible across the state. We had to standardize, going back to your question in terms of Texas, we also pushed on standardizing aspects like MPIA requests, like use of force policies and so on across the state. So we try to find there were clear needs in Baltimore City, but policing itself needs massive reform. And so the more that we were able to push at a state level for just some basics, the more that we had something to rely on. So and what I would say to the question around what does this mean moving forward is, we need to be very clear. We encourage everyone to speak out on what kind of policies we want to see change, and Baltimore residents can get it done. It's a multi-year struggle.
Yep. And Sergio, you spoke on a lot of moments, right, in the organizing movement. A lot of those moments being small victories that we should bring back to community to celebrate, right? When we were able to dismantle the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, when we were able to organize and chip away. And those, to answer the question, right, those are the ways to agitate folks into the problem while also inspiring folks to sustain, because we can see the light, right? Through almost 11 years of fighting local control, for us to be able to take it to the streets and knock on over 47,000 doors, because we were in referendum, and hearing from many community members that they weren't sure what it meant to have local control. And all of that efforts resulting in 82% of Baltimore residents saying, yes, we need local control, and us being able to take that next step towards that victory because of people power. Those are ways that we can talk about these moments to sustain and empower folks to be part of this movement, rather than to only be reactionary when there is a crisis moment.
Right, and it's important that we recognize that when we talk about this 11 years as a coalition, the recognition of, for lack of a better term, the long game, where we have organized around obstacles around these years, and we talk now of how that effective organizing has impacted police reform and accountability around the state. The one thing that we can say that the governor has done is appointed me, formerly incarcerated activist and advocate, to Maryland's Police Standards and Training Commission. And
We love to see it, right? We love to see it.
but I mean, that's big because we still fight until November to actually gain local control, but we still have a statewide commission that regulates what every department around the state has to do now. Now we're gaining this piece of being able to legislate and create accountability mechanisms locally, but we still have the historic Maryland structure in the state where a lot of our fight over the past decade has been convincing 22 counties that never have even come to Baltimore, and the only thing they know about the city is what they see on the news, that these things are necessary. And that momentum now pushes. I can remember 10 years ago, and I was appointed to the Civilian Oversight Task Force. And I can remember, like we talked about, being in all those meetings where I was the only one there. And I brought in the perspective of an entire coalition and its base, and it moved the work, chipped away. And now I sit in these PTSC meetings, and once again, I'm the only one with my background, but now I know that with our structure and our organizing and our engaged base, now we get to have that same chipping away movement at the state level as well.
So I want to jump into something that was kind of previously surfaced. And I want to shift us a little bit into more strategy, right? How do we win? Because y'all, we are winning. And I think that that's something that often we miss because we are so deep in the work and the world looks like it is. But there are places where we are winning. And so, but I want to think about the optics of Baltimore a little bit, right? So, Sergio, you surfaced, in so many words, the wire, right? What people think about when they hear Baltimore oftentimes. Don't. Think about our great crab cakes, our beautiful harbor, the two-step. Do that, but don't think about the wire, please. Public service announcement. But the face of Baltimore for generations has been Black leadership. But in this particular case, in this moment, our Black mayor, who was kind of known to be young and hippish and progressive, and ran on a police accountability platform. Tell us about where he showed up during the fight, and where were there gaps in what he ran on and how he showed up, and how did those gaps influence our organizing?
So I think this is a great question, right? So similar to our governor, right? Black guy, but I think the first thing you have to remember is that identity politics shouldn't be a litmus test for progress, right?
Say that one more time for the people in the back.
Identity politics shouldn't be a litmus test for progress.
Okay, say that one more time for the people on Pratt Street.
Identity politics shouldn't be a litmus test for progress, right? And that's not to say that there isn't progress made, and like you can't use that as some judgment or a piece of your assessment, but it shouldn't be the only, right? And so when we think about the Baltimore City Council, we think about the governorship and seeing them starting to trend younger, more diverse, right? Like that is for a reason, right? Also recognize that they are the safer choices, right? There are other choices out there that are less safe to the power structure than those people. And so that does not mean that they can't be pushed. That doesn't mean that they can't align on the right side of history. And sometimes do, but like that requires work, and that requires like seeing the long game, similar to what Ray said, right? So when we're talking about strategy and we're talking about the question around local versus statewide stuff, we had to be really clear. One, we didn't always agree on strategy. Let's just be very blatantly honest about that thing. We didn't always agree, but long game means like even through disagreements, you work on the thing that you don't agree on because we have to see the experiment through, right? It means that we chip away and we organize our people into positions of power and in formations, right, and learn structures. So like the beauty of this coalition isn't that not just that we won local control or all these other things. The beauty is that actually we know how to write our own policy and push it through from start to end, right? We know how to form our own implementation mechanisms to hold them accountable. So when Ray talks about all these other committees, these are actually implementation mechanisms that we legislated into our policies so that we could put ourselves on them so that we could see the thing through so we know that it works, right? And where it doesn't work, we can course correct so someone else isn't doing it for us, right? And so when we talk about not just winning, we have to be ready to govern.
Right.
In terms of, in terms of Mayor Scott's participation, I mean, he ran on local control. When he was a council member, he was one of the staunchest champions for it.
Can I read a quote from him?
Yeah.
That is on the board. It says, local control of BPD, the Baltimore Police Department, is about racial justice. It is about police accountability, and it's about representative democracy. That's what he said.
And then he was elected mayor. You know, and not to diss him, but just of pointing out, like, then once he got that access, he also had a whole lot of folks to appease, a whole lot of different folks to figure out how to make, just how to navigate all this. And he started to slow down on something that he had been championing on. Thankfully, this is the importance of people power, of long-term community organizing and structure. It didn't really matter because we knew what he ran on. We had been doing public education for years on the importance of this. We had folks organized around the city and allies around the state. And while he may have lost track of the ball as he was trying to do everything else, we made sure not to lose sight of that. And to make sure to, just as Sam did, to point out what he said, to point out what the commitment is. But fundamentally, it was about knowing that no elected official is going to be, it's just, sorry to be, I'm not trying to be cynical, we all know it. Elected officials don't lead, they follow. And so the more and more that community is organized, the more and more that they figure out who to follow and who to be consistent with. And on that note, grateful to see that now, with re-election and everything, Mayor Scott has been actively pointing out, yep, we needed this, and it's happening, and so on. But it was Baltimore residents that made sure to push to see it through.
Please, we can take another beat, pause. How are y'all feeling? With questions?
My name's Carol Joyner. I live down in D.C. We're cousins.
Hello.
Okay. I'm with Family Rights Network Action. And the issue around local control is happening in many black and brown cities across the country.
Ooh,
We
yes.
saw it in the care world, where when we started passing paid sick days on a local level, they started preempting the law, so it had to be done at the statewide level.
Right.
We couldn't do it on a citywide level, right? And clearly around policing and resources and water, as you mentioned, there's total control, which is, a long-term control, Ray, as you said, of black and brown movement and bodies in our country. And I'm wondering, just kind of going outside of Baltimore, if there's a national conversation happening about, what the landscape looks like in terms of preemption and local control and how that's affecting people in many, many communities, and whether or not there's a space for folks to have a national conversation that protects local control and is codified into national law that we have it, and also recognizes that sometimes local control is harmful, right? Whether this happens with labor and some other things, they try to pass egregious right to work laws on a local level, all of that. So really just problematizing it a little bit and asking about national, conversations.
Yeah.
Love that question. I'm going to tap Raleigh for an answer to lead us off. Are there any other feelings? I know we organizers, we're not used to talking about our feelings in panels, but are there feelings or questions that are percolating for y'all? Yes, friend. I see you in the blue, and then I see you in the black.
Yeah, my question was just about, earlier, there was a reference to 22 other counties, or 22 other areas, trying to pull them into this effort. And so I was wondering, what was kind of some of the strategy that made that effective, or the messaging that made that effective? Just like what was just said, this is an ongoing issue where things get moved up to the state level to block action.
Yeah. Who child? And now our friend right here in the black.
My name is Ainsley. I'm from Common Cause, Maryland. And
From where?
Common
Common
Cause.
Cause.
Common Cause, Maryland. I'm a Baltimore County resident. You mentioned something about disagreements within your coalition, and like since your coalition is so large, like how did you go about building this coalition? How do you guys work through those disagreements to make sure that you guys are like all on the same page and accomplishing as much as you can?
Which one do we want to start with?
So let's start in order of operations. So let's take our first question here from Family Values at Work. Action.
So as far as the national conversation, I think, all right, let me take a step back. The first thing I'll say, and this is to the detriment of the left, is we react. We don't strategize or plan, right? And so we are reacting to plans from the right, which is them doing local control, running everybody in their mama gym for whatever they can run them for, right? They are trying to localize what they can and federalize what they can't. And so like just naming those as like the conditions we live in, I think those on the left are starting to notice those things and we're trying to shift towards a national conversation. I haven't been a part of any directly, but I know that there's whispers and folks interested, and so we do need to have that, but like that is to our detriment generally on the left, is we react. We be like, oh, this happened, now let's like figure out our plan, versus like, okay, the right is just gonna get more powerful for the next 3 years, right? Like, what do we do to like mitigate that or stop that from happening, or better yet, to grow our own power? And that's, so like that's my like critique of ourselves, and I guess my answer to your question.
In terms of the question of how did we get involved, the 22 other counties, right? I think that 2020 and 2021 was a big moment for us, particularly as the legislator continued to use the big excuse of we can't only talk about Baltimore issues during a state legislative agenda. And although we're all coming together in a coalition for Baltimore City, our bases stretch beyond Baltimore City into Baltimore County, into Anne Arundel, into all different counties. And that was a moment for us to also organize some of the victories we had won in Baltimore City, like police oversight, knowing that there's still so much work to do in our Civilian Review Board, but utilizing some of those mechanisms to have other counties ask for more, right? So in 2021, we won the police accountability boards for the very first time in other jurisdictions of Maryland, where Baltimore was the only one who had an existing oversight.
PG had one.
And PG as well. So we went from only having 2 counties in the state having oversight to now all of the counties having police accountability boards as of 2021, right? And bringing other folks into the conversation has really allowed us to expand that solidarity and support. To the question of how we came together as a coalition, it's been already 11 years, right? I think it's back to Ralik's point, right? We don't have to agree on everything, but it's making sure we have foundational principles when we came together. And we're a very diverse coalition, right? We're a coalition of Black leaders, Latino leaders, Jewish leaders, right? And making sure when we first came together in 2015, a lot of us came together and did undoing racism trainings, right? Established a lot of principles for us to move forward and do this work, and also realize that it can't be a table of advocates speaking for the people. We have to create a mechanism where there is checks and balances, and we all have a base that comes together and says, these are the priorities we need to work on, but we need to make sure our base is also part of that undoing racism training. So in 2015, we actually did over 300 community members who were part of those undoing racism trainings. We also established principles for us to work as a coalition, while also, celebrating some of the decision-making victories, right? We would come together quarterly, right, in a basement of a church to push the Department of Justice towards the consent decree policies. And as a coalition, our North Star was always that there was always community feedback before a policy went into place. If there was no opportunity for community to have a voice, we didn't want it. Even if we felt as a table, it was a good policy. because we wanted to ensure that there was a mechanism that community had a say. And as you know, as much work and efforts came together for us to be in the basement of the church every quarter, a lot of those policies came to life, and we saw Black and brown folks coming together, reading the policy, giving collective feedback, transforming and changing Department of Justice policies that would be implemented. And those were the small victories that brought Baltimore together, but also brought us closer together to ensure our biggest goal of community always having a voice before something went into effect.
Right, and I don't want to leave us with this pretty painted picture of all the great things.
Well, hold on, Ray, because I want to jump into the coalition politics of this in a minute.
Yeah.
Right,
So,
but I want to
okay.
kind of recognize that I say the first time we went to Annapolis about local control was 2012 or 13. So between 2012 and 2020, I can't count the number of times I've actually heard a legislature say that I don't think Baltimore can actually oversee their own police department. And we talk about how did we convince 22 other counties that this is what we needed. It's a fact, we did not. We never convinced those counties that this should be their priority, but our long game and our consistent advocacy for a decade took the body to a point where, well, look, this thing keeps coming up, let's let the people decide. So we pushed and pushed till they actually washed their hands of it. They were tired of us, and we long gamed them, and
they thought we were going to lose.
right, they said, well, we'll let the voters decide. And like she said, we started our own committee, we had our own campaign, we knocked on almost 50,000 doors, thousands of phone calls, and I want to say 83% of the residents voted in favor for local control.
That is such a huge number. And I want to just reiterate something that Raleigh says all the time. Organizing gets the goods. Yeah. Y'all, and I think that this campaign was just such a clear example, for me at least, that organizing gets the goods. But one of the things I'm actually very proud of in being a member of CJSJ is that we are one of the few coalitions that I know that are multiracial, but are Black-led and POC-led and centered. And we have some like spectrums of beliefs. We have some abolitionists. We have some folks who perhaps are aspiring abolitionists. We have folks who are not abolitionists. So tell us about, one is, why was it important that we be Black and Latino-led as a part of our coalition politics? And how did we work through some of the minutia when we talk about the spectrum of ideas that folks had about how and why to change laws?
So I think the first thing to say is to acknowledge the deep and long history of organizing and community engagement in Baltimore. My entire life, right, and while I think I might be the youngest on the panel, it expands beyond that. There have always been organizing and organizations for people to be a part of in Baltimore City, right? Like, that creates an ecosystem, right? And so when you start talking about strategy, you can't talk about strategy and just think that you by yourself are gonna win all the power, right? And some organizations, they might believe it. That's not what we believe, right? And so we recognize we had to build a strong left and a core. It might have started around policing issues, but we have influence on other things, right? And like, these groups at this table are in so many different issue areas, and we're all like, hey friends, when we like end up in another meeting, right? But like, CJSJ is the core of where we did the work and built our trust. But that's not to say, again, that we didn't disagree. But part of that was understanding values come first, campaigns come second, right? And campaigns end, values will endure, right? And so our values actually brought us closer together in that, like, I truly believe that we are doing what's best for our city, right? We're doing what's best for Black folks. We're doing what's best for POC folks in this city, and like, we're working towards that. Our tactics, again, aren't always the same. I personally am an abolitionist, right? And so where I lean is sometimes different than where my colleagues lean. But how do we build tactics and strategies that complement each other, right? And so sometimes that might have been like when I wasn't at LDF doing, some direct actions or some protests, right? And like, then the other folks being like, Raleigh's really angry. I'm gonna go talk to this person because they're a little bit less angry than Ralik right now, and then they're gonna give us what we want, not knowing that like I've already talked to my friends and been like, I'm just gonna be angry, right? And then we're gonna see what happens, right? Like, or vice versa, right? I'm not the angry one and like I'm the reasonable one, and they're like, hey, can you calm them down? I'm like, they want this thing. I really can't help you unless you give me this thing to give to them, right? And recognizing that we have to negotiate and like build that power, but also the functions to express that power, right? Protest is all well and good, but can you do a referendum? Can you write the policy? Can you, get the people in your community to run for office?
Yeah, related to that and to the question, Sam, around the importance of black leadership. Part of what I've seen be effective in terms of the local control fight has been that it's also helped us out when, because we have black leadership in our city. We have a very solid, at the state level, black leadership across the state, not just in Baltimore. And so that can also turn into, well, these folks are elected and they're saying that we need to like water things down even further. And so I feel like in some other spaces where there wasn't an explicit focus on not identity politics, but on values that talk about the importance of black empowerment, that allowed us to have the space to be like, we cannot compromise on this. It doesn't matter if Mayor Scott was a solid ally with us years ago and now things are rough or like he's worried about it or whatnot. It's been over 150 years, and the consequences of a lack of accountability just keep getting worse and worse unless we just take it head on. And so it's allowed us the space in which to make sure that we're not just saying we don't get suckered into identity politics, but that it's very, very clear where we're coming from is black empowerment in a variety of ways, not just electoral.
Ray, did you want to tap in on this question?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize one difference that we adopted early on in CJSJ is we are organizing for change. So we talk about the influence we've had on local policy, state policy, elections, things of that nature, but in essence, those are all the steps and the mechanisms we would use to actually realize the change that we kind of mapped out as a community in 2015 when we convened. And I think that is the fire that burns all of us, because we set what we considered then an uncompromising goal, which was a police department accountable to the people they were paid and sworn to serve. So in the end, that doesn't stop when we get full, unquestioned local control in January. And that doesn't stop when we get on these commissions, because the push is to actually see the change, not just in the policy, not in a news story, but actually see the change in those impacted communities that we represent.
I also want to add to, I think, your point, friend, that one thing that I think makes our coalition has allowed us to have the longevity that we've had is that we deeply trust each other. And we have a deep set of relationships here. So I know that even if I might not agree with something that someone says in the coalition, or even their political viewpoint on a thing, that we have a commitment around a goal, and I trust that these are people who always have the best interest of the people, of our people, at the front of their mind. And so it allowed us to engage with each other in a much more humane and less transactional way, and to like have conflict, but also move through it, through one-to-ones, through strategy sessions, through roundtables, through political education with each other. And so we trusted each other. But my last question for the day is around hope. Is anyone feeling a little hopeless in the world? That's okay. That's real. I believe that organizers are hope dealers, y'all. That is our calling. And so how are you all cultivating, tending to your hope in this moment?
Want want to start?
Please do.
So for me, I think, like I said early on, I'm from that community. I've lived the circumstance that we see on TV when Baltimore is represented, and I hope that now, as we push these things and we're recognized as advocates and we build this base, that will garner engagement and convince the everyday resident that if he can do it, then I can do it. He ain't nobody. He doesn't have a degree or whatever the case may be. If we want to change something, that we all have the ability to do it. And that becomes that much more important in my organizational work because we now have marijuana disposition from the governor, the pardon 175,000, where every resident in the state of Maryland can now vote, where that education piece and showing people through the work we've done that we have always been the catalyst to our own change. And hopefully this can garner more engagement, and hopefully as we bring the police department into the city, then we'll have more of a engaged aspect of building what we like to call a community policing model. And I will say there's a debate around the whole country about what is community policing. Is it a tactic, or is it something you can train in a classroom? And how many hours does a police officer need to actually be a part of a community policing? And I'll say that in Maryland, I am the community policing expert. So we can once again show impacted communities' perception of what community policing should be and what constitutes success in that area, and lead the way through making our city safer.
For me, super quick, Baltimore's the longest I've lived anywhere. I've been here for 20 years, born in LA, grew up in Guatemala. But I can't, as folks from Baltimore know, I can't say that I'm from Baltimore because I wasn't born here. But my kids were, thank God. And, that's going to be a whole thing once they start going to high school, and, we'll have to figure that out. What sticks out to me, having lived here longer than anywhere else, is I get hope from our city.
Yeah.
When we commit ourselves, we get things done. We've inspired not just ourselves as residents. We've been able to demonstrate effective models for regaining control. We've been able to have models for what civilian oversight can look like. And then once we get it, we immediately start pointing out that it's not enough and keep pushing. I get a lot of hope from knowing that it's frustrating that something doesn't happen in a year, that something doesn't happen in 2 years, but things do happen. And my city constantly reminds me that if we stick to it, we will be better.
I think what brings me hope is being here in space with everybody. What fills my cup is being in community. And I want to congratulate all of you guys in advance for bringing this message, this narration to all of your spaces, far and wide, whether it be here in the city, here in the state, or wherever state you came from, is sharing the story and multiplying it. You could have been in any other panel from the dozens and dozens of panels that are happening right now, and you chose to be in this one, and that brings me hope.
And for me, similar to Ray, it's seeing people build new formations, take on new tactics, and replicate work that we've done. In Baltimore alone, we've seen so many formations pop up in the last few years. We've seen so many folks start to replicate things around charter amendments and other stuff, and taxpayers night, and just a culture around engagement and governance has shifted, right? And so knowing that we have shifted a culture means it'll last, right? And so that is what gives me hope, is that that means I could not show up for this meeting and someone's gonna ask the question.
Thank you all for your wisdom, for your brilliance, for your continued work. Give it up for yourselves. We are so grateful for your presence. And we're here, so feel free. Like, we are regular people, so please feel free to come chop it up with
Yeah,
us.
this is weird.
We'll tell you where to go for good food. It ain't around here. Have a good one, y'all. More power.
Thank you.
Great job.